All right, we last left off in this Cold War lecture series after the Vietnam War. So we're going to move into the next incident of the Cold War, and this is the Berlin Wall. All right, this was built in between. Already looked at how the city of Berlin was divided. Well, this wall was put up to stop people from moving from one side to the other, usually from the communist side to the democratic side. Okay, so this was built to keep East Germans in Germany. For some reason, they kept leaving communist-controlled East Germany. Apparently, they didn't like it. And what was significant about this is this became a symbol of Soviet oppression. Like they're so oppressive of human rights that they have to build up walls to keep their people from running away. And so that was kind of the symbol or throughout the world of Soviet oppression during the Cold War. Definitely a black eye to the communist side of the Cold War. All right, and then in a famous speech, now this one's, before I get to the speech, this is kind of a representative of an interesting story. They had all these, like, those giant arms that come down when you try to get into a parking lot, barbed wire, things like that. And a couple of famous instances is like this guy who rented a sports car, put his friend in the back seat, if you want to even call it that, another friend in the trunk, and then sped in and out and under the roadblocks and got from East Berlin to West Berlin. So people escaped in all kinds of creative ways, or tried to escape in all kinds of creative ways just to get out, even though the wall was up. All right, in 1987, Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, made this famous speech. He went to Berlin and he spoke directly to, at that point, the ruler of Russia was Mikhail Gorbachev, and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Tear down this symbol of oppression." By then, the Cold War was nearing the end, but still, this was a famous speech in reference to that. Another battle in the Cold War, which is a really interesting battle because it doesn't fit the conventional sense of a war-like battle, was a conflict over the space race. Right? And the first nation to have a success here was Russia. Russia launches a satellite that goes around the Earth and comes down. Today, that's not that big a deal, but back then it was a big deal. People in the United States freaked out. They're going to drop bombs on us from space. But this was called Sputnik, and this was the first sort of victory for the space race that went to the communist side. Show that that sort of thing could happen. Space was an option, and the Soviets were the first to accomplish that. All right, the second accomplishment in the space race, also a victory for communism, because the communists were the first to put a person in space. Being experimenting with animals, monkeys, and things like that, but they're the first ones to put a human being in space. Yuri Gagarin was the see his name down here, was the cosmonaut that went up in space, first man in space. It wasn't until the third major accomplishment that the United States was able to catch up, and that was putting a man on the moon. And because the United States was so far behind, this lends itself to some conspiracy theories about whether this actually happened or not. But putting that aside for a second, the third major accomplishment was landing on the moon, and that was something that the United States was able to achieve. So they're constantly going back and forth. Who's got the better, superior technology, the smarter people, the better society, the better system. And so this is a battle of the Cold War, was the space race, in sort of an unconventional arena for that. Another unconventional arena for conflict was just that, an ice hockey. And this was in the 1980 Olympics. One of the events was ice hockey. Here's the U.S. team. All right, and going into this, the Russian team was far superior. They had professionals. They played professional hockey. They were supposed to be bigger, stronger, more athletic, and so the leading favorites. And then you had this team in the picture. The American team was just a bunch of college students from Boston and Minnesota. They weren't professionals. They were just college kids, 18 to 23-year-olds. And so when you put the two teams together, clearly one team had a way better chance than the others of coming out of this victorious. But the United States was able to battle to the championship game, And in the championship game, there was a famous incident, which we will not watch. But there was a famous quote from announcer Al Michaels, the guy who does Monday Night Football. The United States actually got a lead, and as the time rolled off the clock, and where the United States kept that lead, he had this famous quote where he said, "Do you believe in miracles?" Hence the name Miracle for the movie about this, if you've seen that before. And so that became a major deal. This was, believe it or not, a battle in the Cold War. Like the United States beat Russia. That means the United States is better than Russia, even though this was just a hockey game in the overall scheme of things. So that was another battle in the Cold War because it was like the US system going against the Soviet system and which one is better. Even though that's kind of ridiculous if you think about it, this hockey team doesn't represent the entire system of the country they're from, but that's how the Cold War played out a lot of times. And so that's kind of another battle of the Cold War. You can watch that clip online if you want about the famous line from 1980 Olympics. All right, last but not least this is right after World War II was over, but I'm circling down at the end, is the creation of the nation of Israel. It's pretty significant today because Israel is such, in the center of so much that's going on in our world. So giving a little history of where it came from, I think is relevant and important to understanding our world, not to mention the Cold War. So this term Zionism means a movement to get a homeland for Jewish people. And this had momentum even before World War II, but obviously after World War II and the Holocaust, it became pretty obvious the Jews needed a place to call their own, to be their own home. And so this movement really picked up steam. The area that, obviously this is the area that today Israel exists in. Back then it was, 1940s, it was called Palestine. So the ethnic group that lived there, Palestinian, Arab, you could use either one depending on the context of what you're saying. People existed in this area before Israel was created. So that's the first bit of controversy. Obviously, there were people in that area before Israel became a nation in 1948. I guess you could go back biblically and say the Jews had this land going all the way back to Mesopotamia, and then they lost it in the year 70 when the Romans dispersed them and cast them out. So from the year 70 till the year 1948, there were other people living in that land. So that's the basis of the conflict between, one of the reasons for conflict between people living in that area today. All right, the solution by the United Nations was to create a partition. Jews get some land, and then people that were there already get some land too, and they're supposed to live together. But looking back in history, we know how flawed that particular plan was. So you see the proposed Jewish state, proposed Arab state, and then Jerusalem was supposed to be this international area of occupation, in a sense. Right, so the solution was just that. You see the blue area, the Jewish state, the tan area is the Arab state. So that was the solution by the UN. They each get their own area in that sense. All right, the city, the capital of Israel actually isn't Jerusalem, even though that's historically significant. Tel Aviv is actually the capital city. So this became a nice, neutral, more modern, capital city for this newly created area of Israel. All right, when, interestingly enough, as you can see here, the day after, same year, the day after Israel became a nation, all of their neighbors attacked them at the same time. So the nations that declared war on Israel, you have Libya, Syria, Jordan, Egypt. These are not in English, they're in French, but still, all of their neighbors declared war on them and invaded them at the same time, the second day after becoming a nation. Now, what they could have done, other than their very existence, to warrant this kind of anger by their neighbors is another area of debate. But regardless of your take on it, the second day of their creation, they were invaded by everyone. And that's happened several times over their history. They got attacked in the 60s again, multiple times in the 60s. All their neighbors attacked them again. And each time Israel defended themselves. Sometimes they took more territory as a result, like this chunk of land right here eventually became part of Israel. And these Arab areas became smaller after some of these attacks. So that's how Israel kind of looks like the way it is today, and the source of some of that conflict. All right. So here's an example here. So this is how Israel started. Then the Six-Day War in 1967 gave Israel some other territories here. You can see this like the Gaza Strip became part of Israel, the West Bank, once the neighbors invaded them again. And then in the 70s, and also the Sinai here, Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, that sort of thing. That was all taken by Israel in the Six-Day War when all their neighbors invaded them again. All right, and then eventually Israel gave this back to Egypt, and they gave this back to Syria. So some of this territory wasn't kept. And this area today is supposed to be an Arab area as well. So, but that's a brief history of territory exchange in Israel. All right, obviously there's some organizations that aren't too happy that the Jews are there. In the 1970s or so, one organization was formed under the leadership of this guy. His name is Yasser Arafat. It's called the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And obviously you can tell by the name, their goal was to get the Jews out of land they believe belonged to Palestinians. And so that is their goal. The organization is Palestinian Liberation Organization. And their goal, create a Palestinian state, removal of the Jews from Palestine, and that's essentially that is the goal there. All right, and this is from the Jewish perspective, but something I learned when I traveled to Israel, something to think about, is that the name Palestine, the origin of it, according to Jewish history anyway, the term Palestine came into play, existed in that year 70 when the Romans came in and they expelled the Jews. They were sick of them constantly rebelling, so they tore down the walls of their city, they burned down the temple, and they scattered the Jews throughout the empire. And another thing that they did at that time is that they renamed the area, and they chose the name Palestine because it closely resembles the ancient Jewish rival, the Philistines. And so that's where the name, in that sense, came from. It came in existence in AD 70. Probably deserves a degree of investigation to fully flesh out different parts of that story, but it's an interesting thing nonetheless on the name of Palestinian there. So I want to show that to you as just a brief overview. You can get more in depth in that and find out more information for yourself about the nation of Israel coming to creation again in 1948.